to my new studio. Just kidding. Actually, I used to do a radio show. This mic situation setup reminds me of that. But as many of you know, I've been trying to evolve with my content over the years to slow down. Has been my biggest challenge, to learn the technology, and that includes trying to provide a better sound quality for you all. So I'm not sure how I feel about this. I'm in a new room with my son back at college, but I felt like if I could create a setup where I could just sit down and talk, that perhaps I could create more content that was just even more authentic and maybe even more frequent. So I'm not going to hold myself to that. I don't give myself a schedule because I just don't do well. I'm going to try to shoot for 2 videos a week, probably Wednesdays and the weekend, but I would like to, if I can increase that, I will also do that. Okay, so today's video, we're going to talk about the often what I believe are unseen, hidden, unexplained, maybe over-explained or minimized internally in terms of like who we are, traits of autism, specifically in women, because what I did was I watched every top video you could find on people who have lived experiences and research talking about traits of autism in women. But I want to say really quickly that no matter who you are, these things can all apply to you. It's just that I think that because of the way the research has gone and how we've been socialized as women, that I'll post a video with very specific traits, for example, of autism. And people will say, well, aren't all women like that? And so, no, they're not. Although I do think that each of us has autism is an expression of a naturalness in terms of human development. And so, sure, a lot of these things can be present in someone who doesn't have autism. What I really want to focus on this year and incorporate more in my channel is understanding neurodiversity as it includes unmasking trauma, unmasking complex PTSD, and things like ADHD and neurodiversity in general, including autism. Because as I've been doing these, deep dives, I'm learning so much about how many things that we dismiss that really weren't just adaptations and responses to trauma, but were part of who we were since birth. And yet, because so many of us have complex trauma and PTSD, both, and we have neurodiversity potentially, it's really hard to sort of nitpick apart. But I think these things are important if they help you deep dive into more understanding who you are. And number 2, to remove the shame and often isolation we feel like, well, I'm just different. And lastly, to help you create potentially things like more transition time between events, more recovery time after socializing, more real grace for yourself when you're not doing the things you're supposed to be doing, and trying to find ways to understand and embrace who you are. Really quickly, I just want to share this, that it's so funny that I've shared that I've struggled with being social, and I really am someone who seeks refuge alone. And yet I spent my entire childhood alone. And was that because of the physical neglect, because of the time? I don't know. But I would also choose alone time, even when my house had people in it. Was that because they weren't always safe? Yes, but it wasn't like it was a disaster every moment. And then would I choose isolation now after still raising 4 children and I haven't really been alone? Like, I don't really know. I'll check with you in a few more years when I truly am completely alone. But I find that every time I have to consider doing anything social, even making a phone call to my best friend, I have an initial, I don't want to do this, an anxiety, a stress, like it's going to overwhelm me. And sure, some conversations, some new experiences can be overwhelming, but something like that, has really helped me understand more and more about myself, no matter where it comes from, that it's okay. It has nothing to do with the person or myself. It's just part of how my brain works. All right, so let's get into it. Number 1 is related to that. It is social overthinking, anxiety, confusion, self-blame, oversharing, and undersharing. So it's all about the way your mind thinks about how you have to be when you are social. Am I doing it the right way? Am I saying the right things? Often I've found that this idea, and this can go to trauma too, but in general, this neurodiversity piece of a fear of oversharing or undersharing. So I found that there were years where I just blurted everything out, and maybe that was a trauma response, which I think it was. And then there were times when I have been for many years, in fact, more in the last, I would say, 7 or 8 years, very guarded, very not intentionally wanting to share. And does that relate to my job? Possibly, sure. But also just being very walled up. But that also, whether you're oversharing or undersharing, and then you have a feeling about it, not only can those dynamics affect how that social event experience goes, but it can really affect your desire to continue. But the core of this one is just like your brain overanalyzes before, during, as I've said, hovering over yourself, and after the event. What did I say? Why did I say that? What will they think? Things like that. Number 2, exhaustion and fatigue from the overstimulation of being in social dynamics. It could just be phone calls, but having to be on, which is a big part of masking for many of us. And I think all of us do this to a certain extent. Most of us have our at-home self and our outside self, but there's a depletion from having to really manage the sensory issues, the triggers, the stimulation, the conversation, the maybe not being able to stim, for example, during a conversation. And really what you do is you chalk this up to just being tired and fatigued. But really it is about the fact that your brain and body are exhausted from social dynamics. Number 3, raging sensory issues. As I've said before, everything has bothered me, sights and smells and sounds. Smell is a huge one for me, and apparently a very huge one for many of those with autism. And that one's a really hard one to control. I'll say that again. That one is a really hard one to manage and control because, for example, you can turn down the lights. You can, which I'm, huge in the morning, no bright light at night. You can work on your fabric exposure, like your sheets, your clothes. The light's getting weird here, but you really can't stop the smell of happening. Like my kids are making some food and it happens to be at night and it's very triggering. Or it's you're out somewhere and there's a smell. And it can be very dysregulating. So the core is, though, like you cannot often hide the dysregulation. It comes across as bitchy, as entitled, as what is the word, high maintenance, but you have to deal with your sensory world in a way that you just naturally over time try to control. And you don't really necessarily know that that's what you're doing, but that's the core. Things like sleepovers, right? As a kid, I remember thinking, well, if I can't sleep in a bed at your house by myself, I'm not going because it would just be too uncomfortable for me, things like that. The next one is masking. And of course, as I'm saying, that underlies all of this. It's a part of this whole problem, but becoming more and more aware that people are really doing a lot to get through how they want to be perceived in the world. In fact, even being perceived can be very uncomfortable. It's like, I need to be here, but don't experience me, don't see me. And or if I know that you're going to, I have to now manage what that looks like. And I will say that I have become more and more and more myself here. If you watch earlier videos, and my kids would be like, oh my God, you're not really being yourself. Like, you're doing great, Mom. And it was like, I get that. I was trying to be professional and present a certain version of myself. And I think that my clients now, I think everyone once they got in the room with me, I think I'm very much myself while also trying to hold this role, which I also think is changing as we dissect mental health and that kind of dynamic. But the point is that the masking version, the version that we present, is very different. So the Kim that you're getting now, even here, even if you look at my TikToks, which is like it's so cringy, between the filters and the things, I'm still struggling with that. I feel like I'm, for some reason, more comfortable in front of the camera than my phone. And so anyway, the point is you mask and you don't even know it because you're so used to putting on the makeup, the face, the tone, the presentation, the clothes. And like I said, we all do this, but it can be explained away and not really understood. I have a number 5. These are misnumbered, dating issues. And so a lot of issues around romance are often filled with limerence. So a lot of fantasy creation of the person, not the real person. And it can become an obsession. It's like you attach all of the meaning of yourself and value and hopes and dreams and fantasies to the person. I think this is very common in those with both trauma and neurodiversity. And I will say, I made a video about this, and maybe I'm crazy, but I really feel like most people who are neurodiverse have massive sensory issues when they're engaging in intimate experiences, from kissing, holding hands, to everything more. And that, you've learned to like mind over matter yourself, but it can be very, very uncomfortable and triggering. The textures, the taste, the smells, the sounds, I think that's often really hidden and not discussed. The next one is chronic anxiety and depression, a lifetime of a range of anxiety and depressive responses. You might be on the higher end of being able to manage those things. In other words, you can hold down a job, but you're like white knuckling it, or there's a big facade and screen behind what you present to the world and what it looks like at home. For example, you get all your tasks done at work, but your house is a mess. Your dishes are in the sink. Your laundry sits there for weeks at a time. But the rest of the world would never think that that you struggle so much to manage those things. The next one is number 7. You were always sensitive, and you've cried a lot. And you might have learned to stuff those feelings and repress them. But many of us, I think, I used to say years ago, I've just always been an overfeeler and an overthinker. And honestly, what changed that a little bit, and it sucks in some ways, was menopause. That the lack of hormones, in some ways, that's what that whole thing about being 50 and not caring anymore. But it really sucks, to be honest with you. Menopause, I personally think, sucks horrifically. I know I keep saying that, but we don't talk about it. We're not prepared for it. And I've said without hormones, but even still, it feels like someone turned the lights out on my energetic motivation to be in the world. And last year, as I've shared a little bit, I had a lot. I'm still dealing with stuff around that issue, around hormones and surgeries. And I was off hormones for a while, and it was really bad. I wasn't sleeping. I didn't feel well. And so the point is, though, that no matter what it is, there's a sensitivity to the world, and maybe things like menopause have numbed it a little bit, but overthink, and a lot of just intense emotions that might have been misdiagnosed as BPD, for example. The next one is a history of female friendship issues. I think that friendship issues in general are hard for all of us. As we age, they get more difficult. But when I looked back, I was like, I always had up until my divorce in my 40s, I always had a couple of really close girlfriends. And yet when I look back at kind of how those things happen and what happened, I can see this trail, this pattern of intense closeness, of me becoming avoidant. As I said, I do believe that getting divorced, if you really want to understand not only who you married, if you want to know who you married, divorce them, and look at what happens to your friendships in divorce. It's really difficult, especially if you're in a high conflict situation and your friends are still in marriages, whether they're happy or not, just to be there for you, let alone if they're also starting to question their happiness and now you're talking about it all the time. It's hard for both of you. But the history of me trusting female friendships, I thought, was only about my history with my mom. And maybe it is, but as I've looked at it more and more, I understand more and more about the way I show up, who I stay close to or not. And there's a broken trail of friendships for many of us who have, I believe, neurodivergence in some way. The next one is being deeply entrenched in fantasy worlds, right? Maybe you hide these things. Like you don't tell everyone that you watch all of the Harry Potter movies or Lord of the Rings or fantasy books that you read. And you're just a deep thinker with a preference for the stories of human beings. And so I think that we can get lost in fantasy worlds. There can be a dissociation to that, of course. There can be a sort of like a more connectedness to magical worlds and things like that from the brain, the way the brain works, I think, also in neurodiversity. But just being a deep thinker and really attached to those kind of fantasy stories. As I've said, therapy to me is a story. It's a story. Every patient is a story. Every day is a new story. The next one is a massive need for repetition. So doing things the same way. I need to get up every day and have my morning go, and it always goes within a couple of things in the exact same order. And so whether it's repetition through the way that you live your life and your day, most of us need that. Now, if you have that flavor of ADHD with autism, you can also have the ADHD part that needs stimulation and novelty, which can really interfere with that and create, I think, more impulsivity. But at the core, if we're talking about these things, and obviously even trauma too, there's a safety in repetition, but especially with autism and things like neurodiversity, I think in general, we need to be able to predict what's coming next. From the sensory exposure to relationships, expectations of us socially, things like that. The next one is secret stimming. So as I've talked about the blankie, the thread on the satin on the blankie, picking, skin picking, a lot of things that we don't really share that I think that when you look at individually, they don't mean anything. It's when you look at stimming in context to how you manage pleasure, how you manage dysregulation, and the way that you've done it in context with all of these other things that I think starts to point the lens more and more towards a more neurodiverse brain. The next one is proprioception, like really being clumsy. Like I drop things, I break things all of the time. Like I probably break one glass a week, if not every 2 weeks, or a bowl or a plate. I used to have, it's not as bad now. When my kids were little, I feel like you're doing more, but bruising and not knowing where it came from bumping into things. I have dropped things on my toes so many times that my feet have like permanent damage from them, because I hate to wear shoes. So I'll be like, moving into a place, hammering something on the wall. I did this one place, I had this massive painting over this fireplace, and it was really heavy. And I'm such a I'll just do it now by myself person, but it dropped on my feet. And that has happened more times than I care to admit. So we can have a lot of clumsiness, just like bumping into things. That's very common. But by itself, you're just like, oh, I'm a clumsy person, right? The next one is really preferring to be alone and seeking refuge alone. And I think that many of us do this, as I've talked about, for lots of reasons, from our tendency to feel overstimulated, for our hypervigilant issues, having like eggshell parents where we were only safe alone. But there really can be, not that you don't always want to be alone and don't enjoy socializing, but many people on the spectrum need to be alone to regulate. And I think, like I'm saying, by itself, it can just be like, oh, you're kind of a loner. But when you look at it in the larger context, a lot happens when you're alone. You're pursuing your hobbies, you're regulating yourself, you're finding the space and peace in your own mind, you're turning off that mask, right? So that's a common one. The next one is, as I said kind of earlier, faking and lying and minimizing and masking how hard daily life really is for you, daily tasks. And I think when we look at this bill of goods we've been sold about what we're supposed to do and meditate and eat and exercise and be this and socialize and not isolate, it's a lot. Keeping our homes clean, especially if you don't have help. But even if you do, just the daily functioning. So you just really, maybe you lie to yourself. Like I didn't even realize to myself how once I got divorced, I haven't really had, for the most part, it's been at least 12 years, any housekeeper, really any babysitters. And so just I'm still like doing better than most. And I do have a good life and a blessed life. But my point is that I don't like cleaning. I suck at it. I hate it. I put it off. And my house might look picked up, but then I'd have to be like, oh, you need to clean that, right? Things like that. Living near the beach, there's a lot of mold issues and things like that. The windows are open all the time. So we get a lot more dust in the house, but just not really, like I'm saying on the outside, not really admitting that even to yourself, like, God, I'm not really good at this thing. So a lot of faking and hiding how hard daily tasks are. The next one is highly empathic to animals. Being really driven by the injustice of the world, feeling safer with animals, feeling safer where you're in control of the dynamics of human expression and love. I think that gets, she just loves horses or whatever, dogs. She's a cat lady or whatever. But I think there's something about that we often feel truly only understood and safe with other people who are neurodivergent and especially with animals. And then the last thing is that last two things are that you seem intuitive, about things, and I think many of us are, but I think that oftentimes it's a hidden skill of pattern recognition and being really good at anticipating things and reading people, especially if people were your special interest, which I actually think a lot of therapists have this in addition to traumatic childhoods. And so you get really good at reading nonverbals, at making meaning, and you were doing that to also gauge how to respond yourself. But it can be misperceived, I think, at times as, whether it's empathic qualities, sensitivity qualities, which I also think we can have. I also think they are a response to our trauma, to our environments, to how our brains work around expectations with the world and others. And I think that's it. So I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are. I think that when you take any one of these by itself, it can easily be explained as, human nuance, human differences. It could be explained as trauma. And certainly you could say, I suppose, that these things can be. The point is, no matter what it is, at the core of a neurodiverse brain, we had to adapt and make changes. And if you're born, which we know, with certain temperaments and sensitivities, right, more sensitive children to things like smell and sound and taste and noise, like sensory issues or human connection, whatever it is, and then you have trauma, it's going to make these even more complex and required to get through life. So those are what I think are the often unexplained dynamics in childhood. As I said, I literally went through a lot of the top autistic creators and went through their most popular videos from their lived experiences and said, which ones do I notice? Which ones do I notice? I have this weird way of talking sometimes. And that can also be autism. But it can be other things too, right? Just how we are. But I think that I wanted to share what I experience and what I think as I'm opening my eyes and learning more and more and watching and learning about are also true for others. So that's it for today. I hope you found this helpful. Like I said, I'm not sure about this new setup. We'll see how it goes. I'm going to make another video and talk about really this idea of seeking refuge alone and what it means for especially autistic people, neurodiverse people, to need to have alone time. And so we're going to be talking about that. Once again, I am talking about, generally speaking, higher masking. I want to always make the space and respect for those who have different needs in terms of autism and neurodiversity, from ADHD, all of them trauma, and not just say everyone is the same, because we really are. And many of these things create real difficulty in people's lives. It's really difficult. And so let's say, for example, if you're higher on the line of being triggered by sounds and people and events, you can have this need to be alone to manage that. But also, for example, a lot of those on the spectrum report a high degree of loneliness. And so there are real consequences and dynamics to these things happening. And certainly with trauma, the same, right? If people are the trigger, forgetting about anything else but your childhood trauma or adult trauma, as I've also talked about, it can make wanting to be around people difficult. But also we know that some connection, and I think we all have different needs for it, is part of the human experience that so many of us are having a more difficult time with in this world now where we are more and more isolated. So that's it. Thank you so much for being here. I will see you soon. Take good care and have a good day. Bye.